I have Dr. Jesse Hargrove, Ph.D., University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he is the author of, I know one of his book, and the one that we'll be talking about probably the most, but we'll be talking about all of them, is Closing the Achievement Gap in America. And he's calling out of the Little Rock, Arkansas area. Experienced associate professor with demonstrated history of working in the higher education industry, skilled in nonprofit organizations, Microsoft Word, coaching, educational technology, and instructional design, strong education professional with a Ph.D. focused in bilingual, multicultural education, as I said, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I was asking Dr. Hargrove about that because I did some training in the Air Force at an Air Force base that used to be in that area called Chanute Air Force Base. So every time I see Urbana or either Champaign in that Illinois area, it brings back fond memories. Dr. Hargrove, good morning and welcome to the Reading Circle.
Good morning to you and to your wonderful listeners. I am so happy and excited to be with you, and I look forward to sharing. If you can have your audience to tag me on Instagram and Twitter at Scholar22, at Scholar22.
All right, I'm writing that down as we speak. At Scholar, that's SCHOLAR 22, and that's on Twitter. And it's the same thing on Instagram?
That's correct.
At Scholar22. Okay, so listeners, you know how to do your social media. I'll just let Dr. Hargrove know that you heard the interview or tag him, as he said. And again, whenever I get caught up, which I think I can get caught up now that the school year has ended on my end, I can actually take a few minutes and get caught up on all my episodes. But we'll make sure we have that in the descriptions as well. So, Dr. Hargrove, it is a pleasure to speak with you for a lot of reasons. One, because of the Ph.D., and as I said, the Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign, as well as the fact that you've written about closing the achievement gap. Now, I said when I was kicking off that this is an issue that's not just in the urban area, because many think the achievement gap is just in urban areas, but that's not true. That's a misnomer. That's a myth. The achievement gap, sadly, is across the country, regardless if it's suburban or urban or charter or public or private or what have you. So normally what I do is I kind of ask my guests, where did the whole writing begin? But I don't think I need to do that with you. But I will say, what caused you to focus on the achievement gap?
I noticed that the society was beginning to change from the 60s through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the Deuce Millennium generation, which is 2000 and beyond. And I've noticed that as the population began to change, the scores began to significantly decline. And how many students are in the United States? Most of your audience will probably, who are up on it, will say that the United States population is something like 320 million people. But how many of those 320 million are in the traditional preschool education through 12th grade? Approximately 50 million students. And when you begin to look at the public schools versus the parochial and private schools, and now what they're referring to as charter schools, you break down and you start looking at the NAEP scores, and that's the scores that look at fourth grade performance, eighth grade performance, and they look at 12th grade performance and see the National Assessment of Education Progress. That's the nation's report card. It's an indicator of how well students are doing, performing in school at the fourth grade level, at the eighth grade level, and at the 12th grade level. And you start seeing reading scores and writing scores. Those two basically, they do look at science scores, but primarily reading and math. How are students performing who are from Hispanic backgrounds, who are from Black African American backgrounds, and who are from white backgrounds. We know that there's a devastation of Native Americans and the achievement gap. But primarily those three areas where students are distributed throughout the United States, you begin to see 25-point differences in the scores. Why are those differences so high? If you were to think 25%, that's not high. 75%, 75% may be performing well. No, that's not the case. When you look at what's going on, there's a concept in education called the tipping point. Look at integration. When does the culture, if there were 20 students in a classroom, and I'm thinking of the 1960s and early 70s.
Right.
What is considered a tipping point for too many blacks in a classroom? Or when I went out west in Arizona, they talked about the tipping point for too many Hispanics in the classroom out west.
Wow.
Would you say out of 20, what would be too many out of 20 students in the classroom who are 20 seats? 4. If you began to look at 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, or 5, 10, 15, 20. If 5 minorities are in the classroom, that's 25%.
Correct.
That's way too many. It'll cause a concept in education known as white flight.
Right.
And white flight means that your population at your school is going to shift from being 75% white, 25% minority. Those students are going to be, it's going to flip the school district to now begin to move up as those other students are fleeing 75% to other schools, whether they're charter or parochial or private, and they're going to leave the public schools. And once we find out that the way schools are financed in America through a lot of property taxes on your homes and various businesses in your community, money is distributed differently. And they're going to get a quality of education that's different than the other students. And the quality of education that they receive is often, by history, not going to be of a high quality level. In fact, it's going to be a lower level. And the teachers that they're going to get are not going to follow. They're going to follow the money. So, which means that those students that are going on to the other schools, whether they're private, parochial, or charter, are going to have the best selection of the teachers, leaving those who are uncredentialed, non-credentialed, with the growing population of minority students at those schools, which means that they have not been properly trained, oftentimes, by the best schools, teacher training institutions, as we call them.
Right.
And the students' education is going to lack in the reading and primarily in the math area.
So whenever we say, and for those who are not, like I'm in education, so I know exactly what the achievement gap means. And then listening to you as you opened up, I would think the listeners would get an understanding of where you're going. But talk a little bit about when we say the achievement gap, what does that mean for a layperson, for someone who is not in education, for a parent, or even for that matter, for the students? Because if I say achievement gap to some of the students, they look at me like, we don't know what you're talking about. So let's talk a little bit about what do we mean by achievement gap?
Okay, the achievement gap. If on your reading score, for example, 4th grade, whites make 225. Then blacks make 200 as an average score. The difference between 200 for blacks and 225 for whites, you subtract that, you got 25-point difference score. And that is the gap. And the gap, if you were to, I put a little formula so that people can kind of understand the percentage point. When each point could be as much as $10,000 per child. It could be as much as $1 million difference. But 25 times $1 million, you got $25 million.
So wait, are you talking about the funding level per pupil, or are you talking about the potential of earnings based on percentage points? Because the achievement gap obviously is going to have consequences, and I'm just trying to get clear what you just said. Exactly. Is that funding level, or is that income making ability based on percentage points?
If a community understood that it could be losing a state, that is, because the state's responsibility education is.
Right.
If they are losing as much as $30 million just for reading alone in that particular state, and math about, let's just even it out and say another $30 million. That's $60 million.
So you're talking about funding per pupil based on score.
Well, the funding per pupil would be something like $10,000 as an average.
And you're saying that goes up or down based on the gap?
That goes up or down based on it, because when those students drop out, they're being a detriment to society.
Correct.
And if they don't receive that education that we could be investing in, then what are they going to do? Because we found that from 9th grade, when the students are dropping out, they don't attend the 10th grade, 11th, and 12th grade. They're out in society, and what are they doing to make an income for themselves? They're not working at McDonald's.
Correct.
They're not working at Burger King.
And see, that's why I was asking the question so actually, when you're throwing out those figures, we're talking on both ends of the ruler, or both ends of the spectrum. It impacts the money that the school will receive per pupil, as well as for the students themselves. If they're on the lower end of that gap, it impacts their life.
It impacts their lives, because that's how the jails and the penal institutions are going to be fueled.
Correct.
Because at the dropouts from schooling, because there's a growing achievement gap, and we're not paying attention to the gap. The gap is the alarm that somebody is getting ready to drop out of school. And when they drop out of school, they drop into jail.
Correct.
And fail.
And your book is addressing how we can close that. Because, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Baruti Gafeli or not, but I know Baruti's thing is beyond the achievement gap is the attitude gap. That's his thing, is there's also there's an achievement gap, and there's also an attitude gap. So how are you proposing that we close these gaps? Because you're right, sadly, in many cases, or too many cases, and I hate the term minority because I don't feel I'm minority anything, but sadly, minorities usually fall on the lower end of the gap compared to our Caucasian brothers and sisters.
Yes.
So how do we close that?
Well, it's exactly what you said, and that Baruti said, that one of the things is to change the mindset, which you said attitude.
Right.
Okay, once you you begin to educate regarding the impact of the achievement gap, then you got to work on changing the mindset. Who educates our the 8 million students who are of African descent, out of the 50 million, 8 million of them are of African descent. Who are the primary educators of those students? Well, the parents. But have the parents given up their responsibility to the schools? I know that the majority of the students I see on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that the African-American parents are happy to post about how their children at 4 years old are reading, 5 years old, reading, doing math, 4 years old, doing math, 5. But what happens when they get in first grade? All that enthusiasm, all that great mindset of the parent being in charge. They even learn, as your radio station indicates, they learn Bible verses. And you see that on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook of children at 4 years old doing Bible verses. They're reading, they're reciting, they're learning, they're growing, they're developing their minds. So why that parental influence dissipates and stops when they enter school at first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade? Why are the parents backing away from this responsibility in which they were so excited about doing at the 4-year-old, 3-year-old level? She knows how her numbers from 1 to 10.
Right.
He knows his numbers from 1 to 10.
Right.
3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. So I think our mindset starts with our parents regrouping and understanding their roles and their responsibility so that achievement gap isn't widened by first grade. So when they get ready to start taking these tests, by fourth grade, you see the gap.
You know what? I agree with you because in terms of what you just said, and it gets worse the older the child gets and the further along in school the child goes. And I can only speak from my experience, but it seems as if the less and less the parent is engaged when it ought to be just the opposite. And you're right. In terms of the reading, from grades like kindergarten to 3, the child is learning how to read, but from 4 or 5 on up is reading to learn. And that's a big transition because the kids really do like, in those lower grades, they really do like those little stories and reading, Mickey Mouse and reading about Spot and Jane. And they really do like reading those little stories or whatever the characters are these days, SpongeBob or whoever. But once you now get to like that 4th, 5th grade area, now the responsibility of, look now, child, I need you to read this and then be able to comprehend and paraphrase and tell me what you got out of it and what the author mean and all that. That transition causes a big struggle for many of our children. And you're right. If they don't have the parental support for whatever reason, that's where for me, the question I always ask is this, Dr. Hargrove, where does the bus pull off and the child is not on it? I mean, is it in like the tiny grades like you're talking about, like in the kindergarten, first, second? Because when I was a child, I had one friend who got left back in kindergarten, and we had never heard of anybody getting left back in kindergarten. But nowadays, that's somewhat common. So my question always is, and I think it's the same question you're talking about with the gap, is where does the bus pull off and the child is not on it?
And that's, so the parent has a lot of impact variables. And when we're finding that they're indicating that they had to work more situations and they're not available to the child for reading, for practicing with their alphabets. You know how they love practicing with their alphabet. A, B, C, D, spell cat, C-A-T. And the child is so excited, and they're showing the child on Facebook and Instagram and all of this stuff, reciting all this. Then you hear later on, when the school starts having the PTA meeting, that's when you see the teacher wants to know why are the parents disappearing.
Right.
They'll show up for the occasional play that the child is in. they'll show up for one of the parent-teacher conferences early on, but when you send a note home by the student to the parent, they will be unengaged.
Right.
And say that I can't go back out there because you are acting up in the classroom. I have to work. I can't keep taking off my job coming out to that school. So now they're calling the teacher on the phone.
Right.
Because the physical presence cannot be, they are not showing up at the physical presence in the classroom. And so the school is virtually raising the child on behalf of the parent.
Right.
De facto.
Right.
De facto. So they're shifting the responsibility parents are to the school. And when they come home, they have given the child all type of you need to be in here by 3 o'clock. School is over at 2:30. Or school is over at 3:30. 4 o'clock, you're in here. When I get home at 7 o'clock, from 4 to 7 is 3 hours, right?
Right. That's right.
The food is already warmed up for you. Already prepared for you. All you do is put it in the microwave and have your dinner by yourself, right?
Right.
So the child is pretty much raising him or herself because the parent does not have the time. They're working, perhaps, this is a second job.
No, you're right. And you know what? All of that is contributing because times have changed drastically and all of those things are contributing. And I know where the area that I'm in, and it's going to sound bad, but the parents themselves didn't appreciate education when they were children. And so now that they have children, a lot of the things that the child has, or like in terms of homework or study, the parent is not equipped to do even if they wanted to.
That's right.
So, and like you said, many are working 2 jobs. They're not home. The latchkey kids have gotten even worse over the years. So then, given that we know all of that, what is it that now what is going to have to take place? Because you're right. The school, sadly, has taken on more and more responsibilities that ought to be done in the home. How do we then, if that's the case, how do we do what we need to do to close the gap, given what we just said? Because that, and I'm a school principal. That's one of the reasons I'm asking, because I see it every day and I know exactly of what you're talking about. And it seems like the gap is getting wider and wider and wider. And like, for example, and this is crazy, that latest test that's come out the park. Last year, my school, sadly, that we got our results in the past year, and only 10% of our children passed the math section and only 14% passed the language arts section. Now, 10% and 14% in anybody's anything is an F.
Yes.
So how do we begin to make inroads into helping our children become better readers and better mathematicians, not just for the sake of book learning, but for them to be able to function in society at some point? Because that's my fear, that we're pumping out a lot of kids who aren't going to be able to do much unless it kicks in somewhere and they get it. But they're not going to be able to do much as an adult if they don't, especially what we know is coming down the pike in terms of technology and artificial intelligence and the Bitcoin thing. And I'm trying to think of, there's another thing that's coming down the pike that if folks can't read and comprehend or compute, they really are going to be left behind.
Yes, that's right. And look at this cycle. What do we do to assist our young people? If you were to make a circle and split it into 4 parts, winter, spring, summer, and fall, where is the loss of learning on that chart? Is it in winter, spring, summer, or fall? I would say it's in the summer months.
I agree. I agree.
What are they doing? And that's right now, right? Correct?
Correct.
What are we doing? What are parents doing? What are they doing now to close the gap so that when the fall arrives, the student will have taken that loss of learning time in the summer and converted it, fueled it, given it the energy by going to libraries on occasions in the summer, going to Barnes and Noble, a bookstore, any bookstore.
Right.
Where there are free books in there to read.
Absolutely.
No place to sit and study and practice on just 5 problems. Don't give them 10 or 20. Give them 2 or 3 problems and work on those problems there. Just 1 or 2 or 3 problems in math, reading. Work on 1 chapter of a reading, and what did you just read? So the child keeps that frame of reference, keeps that mindset, that attitude that you refer to for achieving and learning and growing and developing his or her young mind. So now the next phase, school is getting ready to start. Your child is ready and excited for school to start. They got their new clothes and they got a new attitude. They're ready. I'm going to be ahead of these students because I studied over the summer. I have that right mindset. Now I'm entering school in the fall with a ready-to-learn mindset, where that is the time from August to December that they're going to be learning all of the math, all of the reading, because the next semester, around February or March, they're going to take what? Those achievement tests to find out where they are in their progress.
That's correct.
You see, and so that's the type of winning attitude and circle, because our children, the majority of them, that is, don't use that summertime appropriately for learning and engaging into reading.
That's correct. And as a matter of fact, parents, if you're listening out there, and educators, that's one of the strategies that Dr. Hargrove just gave. If we would now actually go out there and do it and not just allow our kids to be out on the street riding bicycles and playing jump rope. Now, they need to do that. Don't get me wrong. But some time has to be carved out where some academics are practiced over the summer, because you're absolutely right. Our children come back in September, and it's like we're starting from ground zero. Things that we know were taught the prior year is like we had not said a word. And so that is definitely a strategy in terms of closing the gap. And the other one that I heard you give, and this is beyond the parent and the student and the teachers, this is something in terms of school districts need to hear of what Dr. Hargrove just said. We are going to have to slow some of these things down, because one of the biggest things that I hear, Dr. Hargrove, is the teachers feel like they can't really get a child to master anything because they have to move along with the pacing guide. And the pacing guide is quick. It's aggressive.
That's right. And look what the schools do at the end of the spring semester. And the students are getting ready to go home for the summer. They issue, most of them do, or they have it on a website, a reading list for over the summer. Or if they don't, the parents need to ask for
correct
a reading list so that the child can start reading some of the works that the next grade level, when they come back in the fall, will demand of them. Read some of the books. What's in 1 or 2 problems in math that the child gets in May or June that they can read over the summer in June, July, until August they come back, so that the child is familiar with the material that they're getting ready to go over for the next grade level.
So now the strategy assumes that you have a child who likes to read or wants to read, or a parent who encourages reading. What happens whenever you have, because now in this technological age, with everything is with the social media and everything is with video games, what do we do with a child or children who don't like or want to read?
Well, we have to work with them one-on-one as far as, now what I do, we have a bridge program at my college, Philadelphia Smith College in Little Rock.
Okay.
And These are students coming from all over the United States, in Illinois and California and Louisiana, Florida, and they are New York, whatever. They're coming here to get a head start. In fact, the program is called START, where they strategically get a head start on the students who didn't participate, and they're going to have a head start for the fall. They're taking reading, writing, math, English. They're learning about personal development. How do I develop the self-confidence to master college material? How is society developed? And what does society expect of me? Do I have a plan for my 4 years going through this college? And then what do I want to do with my life and my career? That's personal and social development, which is a new course that we discovered that we need to put together, because these students coming from high school all over the United States, don't have a clue of what they want to do once they get in college in the fall. But we're preparing them now in the summer of what to expect in the fall. How a teacher lectures, how you're supposed to take notes, how you're supposed to read. So we give them prompts, and I get that prompt comes from when I taught middle school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Broward County Public Schools, the fifth largest school district in America at the time. Dade County in Miami was the fourth largest school district in America. And I did my research down there. But at any rate, that is the type of thing that you really want to focus on. You want your students to start being prepared for the next grade level before they get to the next grade level. That's how they stay ahead of the ball game.
That's absolutely right. Now, you're in a college, so I know some of these things that we're talking about. I know how it impacts the college level, because many of the students coming in have to start with remedial courses.
Yes, because they are not college prepared. So in the fall, you don't want to waste parent loan money, student loan money,
right,
or even grants from the federal government on taking remedial courses in the fall. You want to start your college curriculum so that you can be finished within 4 years. The more you go, the longer you go, 5 years, 4.5, 5 years, 6 years, the more tuition.
Correct.
The more debt you get into. And it's expensive. These students are getting as much as $60,000 worth of debt.
Correct.
You don't need to have $60,000 worth of debt. You need to come in, for example, our college costs $20,000 a year.
Right.
That's 10 in the fall, 10 in the spring, 20,000. And that includes room, board, tuition, and fees.
Correct. And see, this is where this whole thing, parents listening out there and educators and students, this is where this whole thing connect. You don't get it in those lower grades, like in kindergarten or pre-K, first grade, second, that bus that I was talking about that pulls off and you're not on it. Yeah. If you're supposed to have certain skills at the end of first grade, and for whatever reason you don't have them, it will impact you all the way up to the line when you get to the college level. And now you have all these remedial courses you have to take of skills you should have gotten whenever you were in elementary, middle, and high school, that the colleges now have to take time, and they charge you for it, to try to catch you up. This is what we're trying to head off. And this is why the gap is so important, that it has to be closed, because as long as we're on the lower end of that gap, it's going to cost us more money, as well as we won't earn as much money. And
remind them that the language has changed in schooling. For example, what in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we referred to the gap, not as the gap, but racial inequality.
Right.
That was the old term.
Right.
Inequality. And so to make things equal, you have to put education as the option out there. Education is the great equalizer among people. And if there's a gap in their knowledge, in their learning, in their information, then they're not going to be as equal as the others are. And that's why we want to pull up that inequality and make it equal to the others so that they can compete at an equal level. Right now, it looks like the others are saying, well, affirmative action used to be the thing. Now there is no affirmative action.
Right.
That's gone now. They've taken, the society, that is, has taken away all of those great equalizers because many of us did not get our children to take advantage of that.
Correct.
We relied on the school.
Correct.
Then we started taking away what is known as desegregation money.
Right. And see, this is where, and I know even with working with our quote unquote parent advocates, what came to me a couple of weeks ago, and we, by all means, we need parent advocates. My issue is, in many instances, I don't think they're advocating for really educational or academic things. And it goes back to exactly what you said a couple of minutes ago. Many of our parents are advocating for the school to do what ought to be done in the home. And that's generally what they're advocating. They're advocating for, like, the things that should be done at home, you're advocating for it to be done in the school. And truthfully, as you know, those of us as educators, we didn't go to school for those things. Now, that's not to say we can't do them, but that's not what we were really trained for. And then in terms of getting to the actual academics, because we're wearing so many other hats, we really don't get a chance to focus on the academics like we'd like to. And so that's contributing to the gap as well. Back to what you say. Well, what kind of teachers are in the classrooms?
That's right. And they're having now maybe teachers that are not trained through the traditional route. In the military, when you train officers, they can go to officer training school. Well, a teacher, if you want to be a teacher, you have to go to a teacher training program.
Right.
At a qualified school that will teach you about the importance of three things: knowledge, skills, and disposition. The disposition is the most important thing. That's the mindset of a teacher, to want to help the students to achieve and to learn and to grow and to develop. That's the mindset. And so think in terms of the inequality and the gap as symptoms that a school district has.
Right.
Or in a particular school, it has a fever. And you want to correct. How do you correct a fever? You got to do something about it.
Right.
So with the gap and the inequality, you got to do something about it. You can't just point it out when you go to a school, but you got to get in and do what many of us did as parents, get on the PTA association
right.
into school and work in there. There were only 300 students when I became vice president. They pulled me in. I didn't want to be pulled in, but they trained me starting out as the vice president. And because their children were getting ready to graduate from fifth grade. And they said, we need to get some of those who have younger students down the pipeline. I had a daughter who was 3 grades lower than fifth grade. And so they say, let's bring in Dr. Hargrove, okay? And he's already in education. I had enough going on, but guess what? I had to sacrifice and make time, even though I had all those college responsibilities. I didn't want to be vice president of the PTA at my school, at my daughter's school. So, but I had to do it.
But see, that's another, because in our conversation, you're giving the strategies, or some strategies or tactics that can be used to help close the gap. And that's another one. Parents, get involved with your school parent-teacher organizations or parent-teacher associations, because that's where you can get in there and start making changes as well. So you're absolutely, that's yet another tactic at closing the gap?
What we discovered once we started getting active and involved, and at our schools daily, those of us who were officers of the PTA, we found out that there was a noise level that the teachers had to compete and deal with.
Right.
Then we came up with a program from the PTA and say we're going to have dads, awesome men coming out to our schools,
right?
Just to walk down the halls and to make certain that the teachers had support, so that they'll say, "Ooh, look at these dads down the halls, walking in the cafeteria, doing." And they behaved better. We found that out, and that's what they asked for. They said we need more male role models at this particular school, and so we created the DADS program. That was
absolutely. Matter of fact, while you were talking, I just wrote down on a piece of Dads in the Halls, because I have no problem with stealing ideas, and so that's one that I'm going to think, because I did
and guess what? I write poetry. Dads in the hall. The students don't talk at all.
That's absolutely right.
We were some of the most creative people from the period from enslavement until freedom. And right now, what we are not doing, this is 2018, correct?
Correct.
When did citizenship for the black African American people start in America? 1868 with the 14th Amendment, right?
Correct.
So from 1868 to 2018, we're living right now, 150 years later, and they call that a big word, sesquicentennial.
Yeah, that is a big word.
Sesqui is a half of 100. Centennial is 100. So 100 plus 50
correct
is 150 years.
That's right. 100 and a half. That's right.
Yes. So they knew about the 13th Amendment in 2015 because that was 1865 that the 13th Amendment came out, but they did not ratify the states until December 6th, although it was introduced January of the same year. They would not ratify it until they had to kill a president off, assassinate in April of that year, and then they ratified it December 6th. In 1866, that's when you find all of these black colleges beginning to be formed. In 1866, the opening of black colleges. And from 1865 to 1877, with that compromise president, Rutherford B. Hayes, who could not become president but came up with a compromise to become president by pulling the troops out of the South, federal troops, Union soldiers, and then the Southerners took back over their 40 acres and their mule.
And you're right in terms of historically, we actually did do more with less.
Yes.
Because we have everything at our disposal now. It seems like we're going backwards.
We came into freedom without learning to read and write, but we taught ourselves to read and write, and we didn't have all these expensively trained teachers.
Right. And see, that's where I was going earlier with, in terms of closing the achievement gap, we're going to have to get back to that kind of drive internally, back to the attitude thing again. We're going to have to get that kind of drive back.
Right. And we opened up, and you talked about my other book regarding, and it talks about Solomon Hargrove, how he had a school at his wife's church. She founded Eden Baptist Church in the capital of Georgia. I know you think many of your listeners may remember that the capital of Georgia was in 5 different locations before it moved to that current new city called Atlanta. That's a new city. But General Sherman went through there and burned Atlanta down, remember?
Correct.
And so Celie Adams grew up in the old slave capital of Georgia called Louisville, Georgia. And she founded a church in 1885, and at the church, it was a tree. It was not a building because they didn't have money to buy the wood to build the building.
Now, funny you would mention Louisville because that's where my mother lives. My mother lives in Louisville, Georgia.
Is that right?
That's where she lives.
That is the old slave capital of Georgia that they would say. They sold my grandmother at that Louisville, Georgia, at the slave market.
Wow.
That's what the slave market is. She had to walk around 3 times before someone would purchase her. And she founded that Eden Baptist Church. Solomon Hargrove was teaching his school under that tree when the little boys came by there, white boys, and saw the colored children learning to read and learning to write. And this is in the 1880s and 1890s. He gets lynched 1893 for teaching the black children how to read and how to write.
And this was in Louisville? This was in Louisville.
In Louisville.
Oh, you know, I'm gonna have to have you. I'm gonna have to have you. I'm gonna have to have you back on the show at some point so we can talk history because we're running out of time now in terms of we're heading into the 9 o'clock hour.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna have you back so that we can continue this discussion historically because this is the crazy thing in terms of given the road you were just going down from a historical perspective. We fought and folks died for us to be able to get to where we are. When I said earlier, I was thrilled to have you on the line because you fall into a very tiny percentage of the country and the world for that matter in terms of having earned a Ph.D. and being an African American or Hispanic or what have you. Those percentages are down into like halves of percentages of folks who have earned that degree and are people of color.
Yeah.
And yet we're still talking about trying to get other people to do that.
And it's been 2% African American.
Correct.
Since the 40s, and it's still 2%.
That's correct.
Getting those degrees.
That's
we
correct.
Have not improved it. The numbers have been more. For example, 2% in the 40s could have been 100.
Right.
Now the 2% now is sort of like maybe 10,000.
You're correct, because my wife graduated this year with her MBA, and at the graduation, they said only 8% of the population has master's degrees.
That's right.
So it was 8% for masters, 2% for the doctorates, and so that's what I'm saying. For us, if anything, you would think the percentages would be going higher, and they're not. And then when we're talking at the elementary, middle, and high school levels of the gap widening.
Yes.
And as you said, this is 2018.
And it's 2018, but it is the semblance of a lot of progress. But you can kind of like see with these actions that are happening in modern day of the shootings,
right?
All of the attitude of of indifference,
correct,
from the administration, the current administration,
correct,
or this population, even when white people are killed, you can see the indifference there.
Right.
That this nation does not value education as it once did.
Right.
And you can hear the attacks on the free press.
Right.
And see, that's not black, but necessarily the free press. But see, the attacks not just on blacks and Hispanics and so forth. There is a less value being placed on the American society.
Correct. Now, I tell you what, we're down to our last few minutes, and I am definitely going to have you back because I want to continue this discussion. So you take these couple of minutes to promote your book. You can say anything with the exception of a dollar amount, but how can folks get a copy of your works? How can they get in touch with you? Any websites, your LinkedIn sites? You already gave your Instagram and Twitter feeds and everything, but this is your opportunity for the next couple of minutes to promote. So I'm going to turn the mic off and you can promote, but I'm going to definitely email you and get another date for you so we can continue this discussion.
The work, Closing the Achievement Gap in America, is a national imperative for a superman, a superwoman, and a superintendent. That work can be found on Amazon.com. And you just plug in Dr. Jesse Hargrove, and it'll print out all of my books. It'll print out The Legacy of C.B. Adams, my great-grandmother, From Slavery to Freedom. It's going to point that out, and that's a great read because it's summertime now.
Right.
And you need to know about your history, your heritage, and your culture. That's the summertime you have all type of family reunions and all type of get-togethers, family outings. The 4th of July is coming up. Your family's going to be around. Get them a copy of Closing the Achievement Gap in America, a national imperative for a superman, a superwoman, and a superintendent, or get them a copy of The Legacy of C.B. Adams, From Slavery to Freedom, or my third book, The Best Poetry in America.
Well, I tell you what, I'm definitely going to, is the Celie Adams book, is it Kindle? Is it downloadable?
It is downloadable, and get the ebook. You can get any of these in ebook.
Okay.
And it's not that expensive, so just go and look at it, less than $10.
Well, I tell you what, the Celie Adams book, because I tell you, my mother lives in Louisville, and I do remember her telling me something about that at one point was the slavery capital. So I definitely want to get into the historical piece of that, and whenever I talk to her later today, she's going to be grinning from ear to ear at the fact that during the conversation, we talked about Louisville. So I definitely want to get...
Louisville is going to be in that book.
Right.
And the slave quarter is going to be in that book, so you can see what the slave quarter looked like with my family standing around there. I don't want to say looking like slaves, but they
were. You're right. I mean...
it was there. You can look on their face, some of them, and see this is where great-grandmother was sold.
Wow.
Louisville, Georgia. And Eden Baptist Church is a historic church. And she sits high on the hill. Okay. And she's still a wooden church. She's not a brick church.
Right. Right. I'm going to ask her, has she heard of Eden Baptist? I'm going to ask, she probably has, so I'm going to ask her about it.
That's where Adam and Eve, no.
Well, I tell you what, Dr. Hargrove, I'm going to get in touch with you and we'll schedule another date to continue the conversation. I thank you so much for rising early and joining me, but I definitely want to get the historical piece on this as well. I got to get ready to run because the next DJ's up. But again, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Take care now.